So today we're going to be talking about mid-range zoom lenses and why they're a really good lens for all photographers to have.
And I'm really excited because that is my favorite lens that I use about 90% of the time with my mirrorless camera. The 2470 is the classic range that you see from most vendors, but they do vary. And when you say mid-range, it can probably be somewhere between up until 70 or even 105 in some cases, or anywhere in between. And those are all very useful.
So we both use mid-range lenses a lot, and we use them mostly for photography when we're shooting events and travel and portraiture. There's a wide variety of subjects you can shoot with this lens, and we also use it for video.
That's right, and I guess the biggest reason is versatility, right? It is just so useful, and I think of it in my head, it's like 3-in-1. You begin at a wide angle, and then you go through the natural angle, which is around 35 and 50, and you get to like a short range zoom.
That's right. So in last week's video, I talked about the 50mm lens and why I love that lens so much. And one of the reasons is because if you look through one eye, that's equivalent to roughly 50mm. So it's really easy to compose with a 50mm lens. And so when you're shooting with a 24-70 or a mid-range zoom, then that includes 50mm in that lens. And the reason why he wasn't in that video with me is because he does not like shooting 50, he actually likes shooting 35. So we'll do a whole separate video where we kind of debate with each other about why we like 35 over 50 or 50 over 35, because we both have pretty different viewpoints.
Indeed, with this lens, you are able to get your natural looking images, and you're also able to do more beyond that. For example, when you do street photography or some architecture or interiors, you're able to get a wide angle out of this lens. Even though it's not the widest, you do have it there. And so on the other side of it, you can zoom, and not the most, of course, again, but again, you have everything in one package. And if I was to leave the house with one lens, that would be the lens for that reason.
And one of the best things about shooting wide at 24mm is that it's not the widest. You can indeed go wider to like 16mm, 10mm even, but at 24 you don't have a lot of distortion. So it's actually really great to have 24 as your wide and be able to go in as far as 70. So in the last video, did not clap, I know, I noticed that. So in the last video when I talked about 50mm and I said a lot of professionals recommend that lens for beginners, but I don't recommend that lens. I actually recommend a mid-range zoom such as the 24-70 for beginners instead.
That is true, and in fact when I first picked up a camera to own for the first time, it was actually only zoom lenses that I knew how to use, and I worked out creative process with them much more easily. It took me at least a year or two before I moved on to primes, and I only did it because I broke my zoom.
It took me probably about 3 years to really appreciate primes for the same reason. It's more challenging to shoot with a prime. I mean, optically, and when you're a professional and you know what you're doing, then sure, there are a lot of reasons why primes are better. But when you're first starting out, I think that having one focal range is a big restriction, and it's a lot easier to learn about composition and learn about the other parts of your camera when you have that zoom. So yeah, a zoom is definitely better if you're first starting out and you're looking for a good beginner lens.
That's right, and especially composition is something that you need to learn to such a degree that at first you don't exactly know what is a good shot. You have to experiment 1,000 times, and if you have to only have one focal length, it's very hard to nail that shot. While if you have the entire spectrum of that zoom lens, you're able to compose in a variety of ways and then figure out what is aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, so in an ideal world, if you have the budget, get a mid-range zoom first and then add a prime lens so that you can kind of have that as like your gateway lens as you're starting to get more comfortable with that zoom and you want to challenge yourself more. So the other reason why mid-range zooms are so great is because of their size. They, of course, are bigger than a lot of prime lenses such as the 50mm f1.8, but they're still smaller than telephoto zoom lenses.
In fact, I like them for the sake of being small. I really like shooting in a portable setup, and I shoot a crop system, and I choose the lens which is a variable aperture, which is a 2.8 to 3.5 in the case of the Fuji, and that makes it even smaller, and I make my set so compact this way, and I really, really like that.
So there is a pretty big difference between lenses that have a variable aperture and those that have a fixed aperture. And up until recently, up until I switched to Fuji really, I was always into fixed aperture lenses, mostly because they're the most reliable when you're shooting professionally, and especially if you're shooting in low lighting. You really need that constant f2.8 or even an f4 aperture so that you don't get confused or get bothered whenever you zoom in and your aperture is changing. The only problem with that is that if you get a constant aperture lens, it tends to be a lot bigger, a lot heavier, and a lot more expensive.
That's right. They are also usually better made and you get a sharper image out of them, but it's up to you to realize what your purpose is and whether it justifies carrying that much more bulk. To me, the smaller size and the portability for the sake of video makes it a better candidate of an all-purpose lens than the one that is bigger and has a 2.8. However, that really gets bad in low light situations, so that's really what you need to worry about.
So it completely depends on what kind of settings that you're going to be shooting in, as well as your shooting style and what kind of image you're expecting to get out of your camera. I would say for most beginners, most kit lenses these days, the definition of kit lens keeps changing, but a lot of those kit lenses tend to be variable aperture lenses. And so because they tend to be zooms as well, you can definitely start off with that lens. But I would say that if you ever want to get off of the auto setting on your camera and you want to start shooting manual, you're better off going with a constant aperture lens just because it's a lot easier to understand aperture and how that's affecting your settings. Because again, if you're shooting with that variable aperture lens, then zooming is changing your aperture, so that can get you pretty confused.
You make a good point that most cameras now come in a kit, and the kit normally contains this mid-range lens, and it is actually really a good deal for beginners to pick it up and shoot with it. Historically, kit lenses have a bad reputation because it was a way for camera makers to sell beginners a cheaper and more poorly made lens. But nowadays, actually, they have started giving deals that contain good lens in them, and they're not necessarily a bad quality. This is for sure the case in the Fuji lineup, where they truly don't have bad lenses, and when you get a kit, you get a very high quality made build.
So after you get pretty comfortable with shooting with a mid-range lens, that gives you a really good gateway for getting into a telephoto lens. And such as the 70-200 or the 70-300, those are really great telephoto zooms, but you don't necessarily want to start off with that lens at the very beginning.
Or carry them every single time you go out with your camera. And likewise, by going higher in the range with your next lens, you can also complete your kit by going lower and get a wider angle.
Yeah, but I would say that both wide angle and telephoto zooms are more specialty lenses, and it's a lot harder to compose with them, honestly. So it makes a lot more sense, again, if you're just starting out anyway, to start with that mid-range zoom, because that, again, is closer to what our eyes are seeing. So it's easier to compose that way. Wides are definitely, I think, among the hardest types of photos to compose.
Though they are really fun, and we'll talk about them in a whole different episode.
That's right, yes, we do have wides, we have opinions about wides and when to use them, but they are pretty specific. So yeah, stay tuned for that video.
We like this range so much, in fact, that we have it in every single camera system that we own.
That's true.
So you have multiple systems. Which ones are they?
Yeah, so I have Canon and Sony, and in both cases, the first lens I bought for my cameras was the 24-70, followed by the 50mm. But I got the 24-70 first because I knew, based on previous experience with Nikon, that I love that mid-range zoom. And again, especially for shooting in low lighting, shooting professional events, having that constant f2.8 aperture is really important. The interesting thing for Sony, though, is that I actually ended up going with the 24-70 f4 because I knew that we'd be shooting more video with that lens. And the 24-70 f4 for Sony is the only 24-70 that has image stabilization in the lens. So that actually makes it a really great video lens.
And the other reason is price and size as well are in favor of the f4.
Yeah, and along those lines, 24-70, if you're looking for that focal range, it's, pretty much every big camera maker makes that lens, so you can find it used. I got my 24-70 f4 on Craigslist for like 50% off. So they're really easy to find in different conditions and at different price points. Yeah,
that is great. And meanwhile, I shoot with the Fuji system, which I'm a big fan of, and immediately I buy the 18-55, which on a crop ends up something like a 28 to 85 or so. So it's really generally the same range. And I go for the one with the varied aperture, and instead of the bigger and constant 2.8 aperture, which is called the red badge line, and it's nicer look in the end, but for video it's not as useful without that image stabilization. And in fact, we have two of that lens because you also bought it for your X-T3, and that's what we're shooting with right now.
Yeah. So whenever we're shooting Fuji, and we shoot Fuji mainly for video, but obviously we take some stills in between, and I think for both of us, like 90% of the time, the lens on our Fuji is that mid-range zoom, because it's so good for like every condition except for low lighting. Not the best, could be better, but still pretty good. Yeah, so we have a lot of versions of this lens, and obviously you don't need to have that many versions of this lens, but maybe that proves just how much we love this range. And yeah, we have too many lenses, basically. So along those lines, we're going to be doing this lens video every week. We're going to try to feature a lot of the different focal lengths that we own and why we own them. So I'm not sure what's coming up next week. Maybe next week we'll do our 50mm versus 35mm debate. And yeah, we'll see you then.